Hillsborough Law now. We're coming live to you this afternoon from the People's History Museum here in the heart of city centre Manchester. If you come here, in the galleries of this amazing museum, you will find writings, artifacts, posters, banners, telling of the struggles of ordinary British people through the centuries, the fights that they've had for their rights, for fairness, and for justice. And the question is, why are the galleries of this museum so full? Why is there so much to see here if you come? And it's because when things go wrong in this country, the fight that people face is too long and too hard. When things go wrong, the authorities close ranks. They blame victims sometimes. They sometimes create false narratives that can be very hard to shift. And it's because power in this country is not necessarily in the hands of the many, it's concentrated in the hands of far too few. And access to justice here is still very much linked to your class, your accent, and whether or not you have social connections. That's been the case for as long as any of us have known. From Peterloo in this city 200 years ago through the suffragettes, and then if you come forward to the post-war period, you can still see the same pattern. The nuclear test veterans, Bloody Sunday, Shrewsbury, contaminated blood, Orgreave, Hillsborough, Grenfell. I could actually name so many more as well. Very different events, but all linked by the same thread. The same thread that I described before, where ranks are closed and ordinary people who've often suffered bereavement experience the re-traumatizing effect of having to fight for the names of their loved ones in the wilderness. I say to everybody watching this today, it's time to break that thread. It's time to end the cycle of injustice. Many people have tried to fight back over the years, to fight against the system, but none have done so in a more determined fashion than the Hillsborough families. And we have all watched their struggle, their 33-year fight. We've watched it over the years. We've got to know the people involved, and we've been inspired by it. But this week on our television screens, we really got to feel the terrible human cost of it all, what these families have sacrificed along that lonely road, fighting for justice. It wasn't just the case for Anne Williams, it was a case for all of those Hillsborough families. Lives changed forever, and so much lost in the fight. So today, I'm asking the country, what are we going to do? What are we going to say in response to their 33-year fight for justice? What changes? How are we going to honour the Hillsborough families who've held a mirror up to this country for us? What are we going to do in response to what we've seen? Today, I believe we need to take the weight off their shoulders. We need to take the baton out of their hands. Today, we need to take the fight for justice into a new chapter, but actually make it a much bigger fight for a more just country. And we do that by bringing in a Hillsborough Law now. We will hear today from some of the Hillsborough families. But one of the messages today is that their fight is not an exception. It's not something that belongs to the past. We have, although, unresolved injustices from the past. I'm thinking very much of the nuclear test veterans who this year will go into their 70th year fighting for justice. Think about that. People serving our country overseas, going into their 70th year fighting for truth and justice with their amazing Look Me in the Eye campaign that I believe everybody needs to support. So there are unresolved injustices from the past, but there are also people fighting for justice today, going through much of the same as what the Hillsborough families went through. And we will hear from some of them. Some of them are campaigns you will know about, the Grenfell campaign, but others you won't have heard of. And there are many individuals behind the big campaigns fighting alone, and we will hear from some of them today. I said this was an historic event, and I think that is justified because I can't think of a recent event when two former prime ministers have come together to put their weight behind it on a cross-party basis. Theresa May and Gordon Brown both played an important role in bringing truth for the Hillsborough families, and we will hear from them later today, as well as a host of other high-profile public figures from all walks of life, from all parts of the country. And I think what that shows is that this campaign for a Hillsborough Law now is broad-based, it's cross-party, and it's getting stronger and stronger all the time. Before I ask Steve to introduce our first speaker today, I just wanted to say something, particularly to the government. Today's event is not about aiming antagonism or animosity in your direction. As we've seen this week, my own party had the opportunity to shorten the struggle of the Hillsborough families, and it failed to take it. It must learn lessons from that too. So there isn't any politics here. What we're talking about today goes way beyond that. The government has talked about levelling up, and there are many people who would say, if it's to be real, then yes, we support that. So I will close this part with a message to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, level up the scales of justice in favour of bereaved families who still today are going into courtrooms in this country raw with grief and finding themselves up against the highest paid QCs in the land, brought in by public bodies, spending public money in a limitless way to protect reputations and often create false narratives. It can't go on. It is time to level the playing field. It is time for a Hillsborough Law now. And with that, I'm now going to pass over to the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, Steve Rotherham. Steve.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Andy, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. It's fantastic to be here in the People's History Museum, which commemorates the long struggle working people have had to fight for fairness, equality, and above all, justice. We're hopeful that today can mark another important staging post in that struggle, the day when the wheels were set in motion to restore integrity and trust in our judicial system. Now, I know we've all been captivated by this week's ITV's depiction of one woman's struggle to do just that. Anne is the story of a mother's tireless fight for truth into the circumstances of the death of her son, Kevin, portrayed brilliantly by Maxine Peake. That journey started at Hillsborough at the stadium on the 15th of April, 1989. Officially, 97 men, women and children died due to the injuries they sustained on that day in Britain's worst sporting tragedy. But the true death toll will probably never be known. So many people were traumatized by what they'd witnessed that the official figure, which only includes those whose physical injuries were sustained in the pens at Leppens Lane that day, failed to recognize the significant numbers whose lives were cut short by the impact of the event and the subsequent cover-up. Indeed, it took more than 20 years for those accidental verdicts to be quashed and for the longest coronial case ever heard by a jury in British legal history to finally deliver a verdict that the 96, now 97, men, women and children were unlawfully killed. Unlawfully killed. That day, the truth was announced as a day many of us who were in the courtroom will never forget. But tragically, too many never lived to see that day of judgment. The fact that after decades of campaigning, not a single person has been held accountable for the tragedy is a stain on the judicial system in this country and on the institutions that many of us were brought up to put our trust in. But the case of Hillsborough is not an outlier. It is just one case in a litany of injustices where the legal system has locked ordinary people out of the right to full disclosure of the facts and the legal means to ensure that justice was served. Today is about the victims of those repeated miscarriages of justice and their stories. And as you'll hear from speaker after speaker, the circumstances might change, but the pattern of behaviour in the barriers erected against them remains the same. They've all had to contend with denial, obfuscation, tactics to divide, and attrition, hoping that the passage of time would somehow dull their will to fight. The state was both complicit in suppressing the truth about Hillsborough and in supporting its orchestrated cover-up. But today we will hear how, instead of being the conduit for truth and justice, governments prejudiced its true course. In the case of Hillsborough, it went even further. It was actually complicit in blaming the victims for their own deaths. The mechanisms to change the law have been eloquently set out by Andy. In fact, Bishop James made a number of recommendations in his report, The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. And those recommendations form the basis of what we're speaking about today. But you'll also hear shortly from Maria Eagle about the bill in Parliament that she's moving, and from Ian Byrne, who's working to educate the next generation so that they are aware of the circumstances and significance of the tragedy. But you think that there's a moral duty for those in public office to act only in the best interests of natural justice. But in too many cases, that blind belief in its implementation is actually an impediment to the determination of justice. Sadly, as experience tells us all, we cannot just hope that public officials will tell the truth. They have to be compelled to. Laws can never remain static. We need to revisit, update, and improve the laws as events evolve and unfold. Now, this government likes to talk about levelling up, but for me, it's not just about big announcements and shiny infrastructure projects. It's about levelling up long-term structural inequalities and injustices, and there are fewer bigger than this. Today, in Britain, your social class and connections will determine the level of your access to justice. Our citizens deserve to be truly equal before the law. Ensuring parity of treatment and leveling the scales of justice is the very essence of levelling up. It's time for reform, and it's time for the Hillsborough Law now. Now, I just said that Anne was the story of one mother's determined fight to find out the truth of the circumstances of the son she lost. And we're going to hear from somebody now who many people will be familiar with, whose fight also was about the truth into the circumstances of the son she lost. Can I introduce to the stage Margaret Aspinall, please?
Hello, everybody. This is something that I really should not have to do, and neither should any other campaigners. I find what's gone on over these past 30-odd years has been a disgrace on the system of our nation. When you talk about the scales of justice, I was born under the Libra sign, which is the scales of justice. But they're unbalanced. They're balanced against the victims. They're more for the perpetrators in this country. This country really, and governments, should be ashamed of themselves for what's gone on at Hillsborough. You know, we can go back into the dark ages, and I can't see where anything has actually changed. In the dark ages, there was a system. There was the first class, second class, third class. Well, unfortunately, we've always been the third class. We've been the bottom of that scale. Now, we've done nothing wrong at Hillsborough. Our fans were accused of killing their own. Our dead were accused of helping to kill themselves. What an absolute utter disgrace. Now, we've been called, over all of these years, whinging Scousers. I'm proud to be a Scouser, and I'm proud of our city, and I'm proud of our people, and I am definitely proud of our supporters of that day. They were the heroes. And I'm here today to argue about a Hillsborough law. We shouldn't have to argue this. We should get the Hillsborough law immediately put into place. There's so many people. You only have to look at Grenfell, the arena bomb attack. These families deserve justice. Now, the Hillsborough law will not do any good for the Hillsborough families. But we're here today for us all to be united to change things. Because them 97 victims who died at Hillsborough, they deserve the respect and a Hillsborough law in honour of their name. And if that does any good for the likes of other people going forward, that's all that matters. They have not died in vain. And I am, as I've said before, I am proud of my city. I'm proud of the people. But I'm very proud of our fans who stood by the families for all of these years to help us to get where we are today. We have already changed things for the good of this country. Things are going forward that needed to be changed. Bad laws are there to be changed. And the law within this system was an absolute disgrace. The law, as I've said earlier on, is for the perpetrators. It's not for victims. So why it's important for this Hillsborough law to go ahead, it's got to be a level playing field. There's got to be a duty of candour. That, to me, the police, you should not have to do this. To recognise the police should tell the truth. If they'd have told the truth in the very beginning, we would not be standing here today. When you think about it, we get called whinging Scousers. If whinging Scousers have stood back and not done nothing about the accidental death verdict, that still would have stood. But because of the fight, alongside other people, we changed it and we got the correct verdict. But what happens in the courts? Where was the empathy for families in them courts? The empathy was towards the perpetrators. There was nothing for the families who were going to them courts day in and day out, some of them dying of cancer, and some have died since the last trial. To me, absolutely disgrace. They died tormented. But I've got to say as well, governments, and I'm not going to say Labour or Conservative, I'm saying all governments who've been in power have let us all down. They are the ones who should be ashamed. They are the ones who help the perpetrators. I'm not saying everybody in power. There's quite a few people that I trust. There's quite a few MPs and ex-MPs who are here today that I trust implicitly. But there's only a couple. As Andy said earlier on, Gordon Brown. Without him giving a letter to Andy Burnham to stand in front of the cop where there was 30,000 people to read that message out to the families, we'd have still been with the accidental death verdict. So I thank Gordon for that, and I thank Andy for standing there. Andy made promises to me that day. I begged him, please, please, don't give us any more crumbs. Please make sure that these families get what they deserve, the whole loaf. Andy took that message back. And I thank him for that, and all the families do. I remember Maria Eagle many years ago, who will obviously speak for herself, was saying in Parliament that there was a black propaganda. Absolutely spot on, Maria. And I thank you for all what you have done. There's also Derek Twigg. We've got to remember the decent ones. Well, on the Conservative side, I have no one to thank except one person, and that's Theresa May. And I thank Theresa because when I had meetings when she was the Home Secretary, she actually listened to what I had to say. She gave me promises, and I thought, this is not going to be fulfilled. I'm going away from here, not sure. She fulfilled them promises. She helped the families. So it's so important for this Hillsborough Law to have a level playing field. I remember when we came out of the last trial, I think Andy and I and Steve were doing an interview. And we heard through the grapevine that one of the QCs who was representing one of them three defendants had the cheek to come out, had insult to injury, to turn round and say that these families, their money has cost this country because of these families. And some MPs are egging them on. Absolutely a disgrace. If I'd have been a journalist, or if I'd have been stood in front of him, the first thing I would have said to him, what's cost this money, the country, the money, is the likes of you. How much do you charge an hour to defend the indefensible? And if you're that concerned about the NHS, have you forwarded that money back to the NHS? I'll guarantee you he didn't, because families cost nothing. We paid every step of the way ourselves. And that's why it's important that all of these campaigners get together, unite, and have a Hillsborough Law put into fruition. I'm not asking the government. I am demanding a Hillsborough law to make this a fair and just system for the ordinary people of this country. That, to me, is so important. Them 96 or 97, sorry, wouldn't have died needlessly. At least something good and positive will have come out of it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret. Absolutely brilliant as ever. And something you said there is a message that needs to ring out today. I said, Prime Minister, level up the scales of justice. But I would add to that, Prime Minister, make this a country where the truth is told at the first opportunity. Because if you did that, the distress you would take away from people is almost immeasurable, isn't it? And that's what we want coming out of this. Margaret mentioned in her speech our next speaker, and I just now have the honour of introducing her. I was in opposition at the time when we were beginning to support the work of the Hillsborough Independent Panel, and Steve worked to secure a debate in Parliament on the back of an e-petition that was featured in the ITV drama, one of the first where 100,000 people signed it. And Steve, people may remember, read out the names of the 96 then, obviously 97 now, but the 96 victims of Hillsborough. And it's a moment those of us who were there or those of us who watched it will never forget. And that night, I was on the other side of the dispatch box from our next speaker, and I honestly didn't know what she would say. But she stood up and she spoke with conviction, with compassion, and in the decade since that, she has never wavered. She's always been there at the side of Margaret and all of the other families as Home Secretary, but then as Prime Minister. So it is a genuine privilege, an honour for me today to present to you, to invite to speak, former Prime Minister of the UK, the Right Honourable Theresa May.
Thank you very much, Andy. And it is humbling to speak after Margaret Aspinall. And I'd like to pay tribute to Margaret and all the Hillsborough families who showed such enormous dignity in their fight for justice over so many years. But I'm pleased to be able to join those today who are calling for action to change the system of support for those families who are bereaved as a result of a public disaster. What happened at Hillsborough, the death of 97 Liverpool fans, failed by the state, was tragedy enough for their families. But what followed was injustice heaped on injustice. Years of beating their heads against the brick wall of government and the legal and judicial system, which added untold pain and suffering. And I've been struck in the case of Hillsborough, but in other cases too, at the way in which the state in its various forms acts to defend itself from blame. The very bodies that we expect to protect and support the public seek instead to protect themselves. And this defensive attitude means that families are all too often denied access to the truth, and with that, often denied access to justice. The families who suffered on that fateful day in April 1989 have suffered year after year since then. But sadly, they're not the first families to go through this, nor were they the last. We don't want to see families suffer as a result of public disasters, but very sadly, there may very well be other disasters in the future. And unless we act, the experience of the Hillsborough families and others will be repeated. It should not be like this. It does not need to be like this. That's why I asked Bishop James Jones to review what the Hillsborough families had been through and suggest changes. Steve Rotherham referred to his report titled The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. But the subtitle was a report to ensure the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated. Now, it always takes time for government to respond to such reports, particularly when they're as comprehensive as this one and have as many recommendations. But over 4 years is too long to wait. So first of all, I want to join those who are calling on the government to publish its response to the report. I particularly supported a recommendation for a public advocate to act for the families of those deceased in public tragedies. Indeed, in 2017, I committed to introducing such an independent public advocate, somebody to act for bereaved families after a public disaster and support them at public inquests. Because I believe such an individual, such a position with the power to break through the barriers of bureaucracy and ensure that the families are given the information they need, are given the truth of what happened to their loved ones, and are also able to help guide the families through the processes of the state that inevitably follow a public disaster. That would provide some balance in the system between the state and the bereaved families. And it would mean that the timetable for accessing information and finding out the truth would be significantly reduced. But more than that, it would mean that far from being shut out by the state, the families had someone who was there for them, supporting, advising, and advocating for them, someone who was on their side. What matters now is that the government responds to Bishop James's report and then acts, putting the interests of bereaved families first, rather than the reputation of government departments. If we can change the system so that others do not have to suffer in the way that the Hillsborough families did, then it would be a valuable legacy for the 97. Thank you.
By saying it would be a valuable legacy to the 97. And the next speaker is somebody who, at that stage, of course, it was still 96, but who presided over the Hillsborough Independent Panel as chair and did an absolutely tremendous job, not just in chairing the independent panel, but also keeping family members informed as often as he possibly could of the progress that was being made. And he met with me and Andy and others, and he said that we had to trust in the process, and we trusted in him. So it's a delight for me to introduce the next speaker as Bishop James Jones.
Stephen, good afternoon, everybody. As we've heard from Theresa May, after the second inquest that returned the determination of unlawful killing, Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, asked me to write a report so that we could learn from the family's experiences, so that their perspective was never lost, and so that things could change in the future to prevent other people from going through the injustices that the families went through. And as we've heard several times now, and I make no apology for repeating it, the title of that report was The Patronizing Disposition of Unaccountable Power. And that phrase came to me because, having listened to the families, it seemed to me that this is exactly what the families and the survivors had endured for 3 decades. There were 25 points of learning in that report, and there are 3 principal ones. The first, for bereaved families to come to a contested inquest, legally defenseless, to face state agencies with lawyers and barristers paid for from the public purse, is manifestly unjust. And I hope that the government, in its response to the report, will recognize that this present situation is an affront to natural justice. Secondly, the police must now be bound by a duty of candor and disclose to the families all relevant documents that relate to the death of a loved one. In the light of the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster, and in the light of recent events too, I hope that the government will recognize the need to change the culture of policing and to bring in this duty of candor. Thirdly, all public bodies should be invited to sign the charter for those bereaved through public tragedy, so that when decisions and actions are scrutinized after a tragic event, they put the needs, the interests, and the rights of individuals ahead of protecting their own reputation. And the government could set an example to public bodies by signing this charter themselves. In conclusion, I feel that the film and the documentary about Anne, which speaks for all the families and all survivors, I believe that it highlights all the more the need to address these points of learning from that report. But also, it seems to me that the film and the documentary, whatever has happened in the legal proceedings, is now giving the last word to the families and the survivors. Thank you.
Bishop James, thank you so much indeed for joining us this afternoon. And thank you for the powerful report which you mentioned, the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. And we look forward to the government's response to it. But lastly, thank you on a very personal level from me for the care that you have provided to the Hillsborough families. And we saw that depicted in the drama. You've given that support to all of them, and they've all needed it because so many people have played a role. All of the families have played a role over the years. And there's somebody that we've all come to know very well over the years, who's played a big part in the fight for justice. Somebody who sadly lost her 2 daughters at Hillsborough. I'd now like to introduce to you Jenny Hicks.
Thanks, Andy. Wow, how do I follow the speakers who've spoken before me? Margaret and Andy and Steve, Bishop James and Theresa May. Difficult. I think you've said a lot of what I was going to say. The only thing I can add to that is that my experience of sitting in various courts in this country for 30 odd years now, various investigations, 2 inquests, and the criminal cases, I find that we need more continuity between the courts. For instance, in the second inquest, where we had the verdict of unlawful killing for the victims of Hillsborough, and where the fans were all exonerated, during the second inquest, the judge made it very clear to the jury that they couldn't bring in a verdict of unlawfully killing unless they were sure that it was gross negligence manslaughter to a criminal standard. You then take that into a criminal court and that verdict doesn't stand up at all. It's you have to start all over again, and then the judge in the criminal court takes us right back to the first inquest and sums up to the jury with evidence that was dismissed by 3 High Court judges as being unreliable. How can that be? These are the changes that we need to the criminal law system. And the Hillsborough Law would hopefully help with that. As Steve said earlier, the law should never be static. It should be a work in progress. And hopefully this will help with that work in progress. And finally, I'd just like to say that last year, in the cover-up trial, Judge Davis, when he was first introduced himself to the jury at the beginning of the trial, proudly announced that nothing had changed in the criminal justice system, the criminal law courts, since the Middle Ages. Now, how can that be right? And I was quite insulted by their sitting in that court. I wanted to stand up and shout, well, it's about time it did. And hopefully, the Public Advocate Bill and the Hillsborough Law will make some positive changes that are well overdue in our court system. And please, let's have more continuity between the courts. A 2-year inquest where all the evidence was heard and then it can't be heard in a criminal court is just so unjust. In fact, it prevents any kind of accountability rather than aiding it. So please, let's 2022 be the year when the Hillsborough Law is made law, and also the Public Advocate Bill. And thank you all. As I say, it's been quite difficult following on from the speakers that we've already had, because I agree with everything that they've said. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. And again, somebody who knows all of what happened in 1989 all too well, and another mother who fought long and hard for truth and justice. The next speaker is Pete Weatherby, QC. Pete represented 22 families in the new inquests. Over to you, Pete.
Very much, Steve, and hello to all who are watching. Yes, indeed, I instructed by Elkin Abrams, I represented 22 of the Hillsborough families, and that included Anne Williams and her family, including Sarah and Danny, that you'll have seen on the drama this week. And I've represented bereaved and survivors, some of the bereaved and survivors from Grenfell, and I'm currently representing some of the bereaved in the arena bombing outrage, and I'm going to be representing the main family group in the COVID inquiry. And I'm also speaking on behalf of Inquest, which is the charity which has supported bereaved families for over 40 years. And I was one of the drafters of the Public Authority Accountability Bill 2017, which is the rather awkward but formal name of Hillsborough Law. So I think I have a little bit to bring to this table. I hope I do. And I start by asking, really, why is it that for example, Bloody Sunday and the Hillsborough investigations had to be completely redone decades after they were first investigated in judge-led inquiries and in inquests? And why is it that wrongdoing and failure in this country seems to be covered up time and time again? And why is it that not only the families and the survivors, but also the chairs of countless inquiries and inquests and senior judges with vast experience of investigations, time after time after time, have called for a statutory duty of candour? And why have political leaders of all colours failed to act on those demands and those recommendations? Because it's not just the families of Grenfell and Hillsborough and the arena and COVID that have called for the enactment of Hillsborough Law. If you look at the recent Justice report, that called for the enactment of Hillsborough Law as well. And the significance of that report is that it not only took evidence from wide and far, but it was penned partly by 3 former High Court judges with great experience of this area, including Sir Robert Owen, chair of the Litvinenko, Sir John Goldring, the coroner in the Hillsborough inquest, Sir Peter Thornton, the former chief coroner, and then there's Robert Francis, the chair of the Mid-Staffs NHS inquiry, Bill Kirkup, the chair of the Morecambe Bay Trust inquiry, the Harris inquiry, the Angelini inquiry, the Daniel Morgan review. In all of these inquiries, all of these reviews, the chairs, the judges have called for a statutory duty of candour. And you just heard Bishop James. He's promulgated a voluntary charter and also recommended that the government address the statutory duty that is Hillsborough to it. The former chief constable gave evidence that GMP had not signed up to the charter simply because none of the other public of the police forces nationally had signed up. And I'm afraid that all this, despite the massive efforts of the bishop, illustrate that a voluntary code is simply not cutting the mustard. So why aren't these calls being heeded? Why are they being ignored? And The reason they are being is simple, because public authorities and corporations have serially demonstrated that they put their reputations to the fore ahead of truth and justice, and they employ teams of lawyers not to assist inquiries and assist the bereaved or survivors, but to use every available device to obfuscate and avoid censure. And sometimes, as in Hillsborough, lack of an enforceable duty of candour has facilitated worse than institutional defensiveness and denial. It's led to outright corruption. In many other cases, the truth is hidden because of human weakness, a loss of perspective, a fear of losing face, or a fear of losing office. Imposing an enforceable statutory duty of candour with a toolkit for ordinary people affected by disaster and wrongdoing to effectively participate in inquests and inquiries would not only render such defensiveness virtually impossible, but it would refocus the whole system to changing things for the better for the future. And furthermore, it would massively reduce the amount of time taken by these inquiries, the vast public resources thrown away in the battles royal that the inquiries end up in. So the choice is the status quo on the one hand, wasting vast amounts of public resources, facilitating those charges with acting on the public's behalf and in the public's interest, to concentrate on escaping criticism and reputational damage, defending the indefensible. Or on the other hand, rebalance that process so that inquiries can efficiently deliver what it says on the tin. It's quite remarkable in 2022 that there's no statutory requirement on public servants and institutions and corporations who take the public coin, but then don't tell the truth or don't proactively assist official investigations designed to obtain accountability and to prevent future disasters. And it's even more remarkable last year in 2021 that a court could determine that a criminal case could not proceed against senior public officials because the process, the inquiry they were alleged to have subverted, was a departmental inquiry, not a course of public justice. How can that possibly be right? And how could that be allowed to happen? And it's been allowed to happen because successive governments have ignored the problem. They've inexplicably feared the solution, and they've done nothing except patronise those affected with tea and sympathy. When Andy asked the families if he could champion their legacy project, Hillsborough Law, they welcomed his support wholeheartedly, but they told him he could only do so if he got cross-party sponsorship, and he did so. And the Public Authority Accountability Bill, Hillsborough Law, was sponsored therefore by MPs not only of the three main parties, but also the SNP, the Greens and the SDLP. And this it shouldn't be a partisan issue. But regrettably, the government has not put it back before Parliament, and that's where it's stuck. In codifying a duty of candour, Hillsborough Law would prevent those charged with the health and safety of the public from putting their own narrow interests above those of the public. And the new law provides for a reversal of the current process, where wrongdoers and those who fail to fulfil their responsibilities can hide their omissions and failures. And it requires them to proactively and expressly assist official investigations and inquiries of all kinds. And it empowers those who've been so catastrophically affected by preventable outrages and disasters to obtain a full and truthful narrative of what did and should have happened, who was accountable for failure, and for progressive change to prevent the same happening again. And it needs MPs of all sides to drive it forwards and fundamentally change the approach to require candour, to require frankness, to require transparency, and to prevent the huge miscarriages of justice that we're hearing about from occurring again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Pete. We are proud that you, one of the country's leading QCs, you're based here in our great city. Grateful to you for the work that you did in helping me bring the Public Authority Accountability Bill to Parliament, which we would bring into a wider Hillsborough Law. And you are, without doubt, one of the leading voices for true justice in the legal profession, and we thank you. We thank you for it. If I could just echo one point that you made, and it's such an important point that mustn't be missed. We saw the collapse of the last Hillsborough trial. Why? Because the judge ruled that the Taylor report, that was called a judicial inquiry at the time, the evidence it took, the manufactured evidence it took, couldn't be considered by his court because the Taylor inquiry wasn't a course of public justice, as Pete Weatherby just said. Now, how can we leave that there? How can we leave that there? Because that is an invitation to anybody to go to a departmental inquiry or a non-statutory inquiry and not be wholly truthful. As I said, we've got to make this a country where the truth is told at the first opportunity if we're to prevent that re-traumatizing effect on families. And that is one reason, one powerful reason why the Hillsborough Law is needed, and it's needed now. I spoke earlier about the effect on families of the fight for justice. And again, we saw that in the drama. Sometimes we perhaps don't think about the generation that came behind, those who lost fathers at Hillsborough. So we're now going to hear from somebody who lost her dad, Jimmy, and herself has come to the fore, the next generation, if you like, taking up the Hillsborough fight into a new era. So I'm really pleased to introduce to you Charlotte Hennessey.
Thanks, Andy. So, I mean, my journey's a little bit different, really, isn't it? You know, I was so young when my dad died that when I came into the fight, if you like, the Hillsborough Independent Panel had just been formed, and family members like Margaret, like Jenny, you know, all the other families who were part of the Hillsborough Family Support Group and the HJC and survivors and campaigners, they'd already laid the foundations. So for me, I had the privilege of sort of escaping all of that trauma that they went through. And I'll forever be grateful to them for that, because the Hillsborough Independent Panel then gave me the opportunity to access the statements and, you know, and find out what happened to my dad. Because even though this was 23 years on, I didn't know how he'd entered the ground. I didn't know what pen he was in, who had found him, you know, who had helped him. I literally did not know anything. And it just got worse for me at that point, because then you find out that actually father was alive the whole time. And even his pathology report was a lie. How is that okay? How is that okay that we are lying about the condition of somebody who was already dead to make them fit into a cause of death that wasn't true? And that is still happening today. I had the pleasure of travelling to Grenfell with Pete Weatherby, and we actually met with some of the Grenfell families, and we sat and chatted for such a long time, and listening to what they were going through at that very moment. And there was a gentleman there, and he was getting continuous phone calls from the police. They wanted him to sign his statement, and he didn't want to sign it because he wasn't happy with what was in it. And that was literally 4 years ago. It's now 2022, and we still live in a country where children like me have had to rely on bereaved parents like Margaret, like Jenny, like Anne Williams. I've had to rely on bereaved parents like that. What happened to my dad? That is not okay. It is not okay. We need a Hillsborough law to make sure down to sheer gross negligence, manslaughter, and that is what this was. And I also think that it's really, really important that, you know, people do take on board that this could happen to you. This could happen at any sporting event. It could happen at any type of music festival, or I don't know, it literally could happen to you. Who's going to protect you? You're going to have to fight this yourself unless we get a Hillsborough Law, and we need a Hillsborough Law now. Thank you.
Charlotte, you posed a really important question, which is, who is going to protect you? And that's exactly what the Hillsborough Law is all about. The next contributor is somebody who lost their brother, Michael, at Hillsborough, and it's over to Steve Kelly.
Hi, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked a question. Do I support a call for a Hillsborough Law? And best answering that question to you is, can myself or you afford not to? I, along with many others, fought for truth, justice, and accountability for over 33 long, hard, and very dark years. Out of that came nothing, in my opinion. There is, dare I say, still documents that we've never seen. That's my belief, and nobody will ever change that. There was only an accountant fined £6,500 for a vast amount of public monies spent on trying to unravel the events that occurred at Hillsborough. No justice, not even for the taxpayer. Which brings me to the main point. Accountability. Nobody was found wanting. How can that be? There were people in charge, people who had a responsibility, a duty of care to ensure a public event, the FA Cup semi-final, the Blue Ribbon event back in 1989, went off smoothly. The event was a catastrophic failure, as we all now know. I will not dwell on tales of how it's ruined or changed my life since the disaster, and why not, you may ask. But it's because I'm sick of people who say that usual expression, haven't they had enough? My answer to the people who have this opinion is, look at it this way. How is your mother today? Your father, your son, your daughter, your sister, your brother, relative or friend? Look at them and enjoy your time together, because there is another Hillsborough waiting to strike at another individual, a group, or community. Ask a mother, Doreen Lawrence, the families and survivors of Grenfell Tower, or parents, Nicole and Kai Bangbola, who lost their young son, Zane, aged just 7 years old, to toxic poisoning, by leaving his father confined to a wheelchair. Just three sets of people looking for answers against establishments who are mighty and so very, very powerful, having fancy lawyers who will manipulate every loophole possible, and can support an individual who admits to being a liar in a coroner's court, yet can sit it out in a criminal court and then walk away scot-free. Or senior policeman or a solicitor, only to leave court without so much as a scolding from the judge. Is this justice? Was this just manipulation of our antiquated laws that are used to such great effect by unscrupulous lawyers? The Hillsborough Law will allow ordinary people the same opportunity for legal representation from the beginning. An independent advocate to have unrestricted access to files held in official buildings. Public officials to be compelled to give evidence while not having the comfort to hide behind these powerful organisations or use something as simple as a no comment as a defence. They are, as said, public officials after all, and therefore should be duty bound to give a true account of any involvement on incidents that occur while they are on or have been on duty, or have any evidence they uncover made public. So do I support the Hillsborough Law? Most definitely, yes. As I never want to see anybody go through this ever again, especially without support from the outset. If we can achieve this milestone, then yes, I have had enough. Thank you for listening, and please support a call for Hillsborough Law. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks for your role in the fight for justice over the years, and of course, your personal support for Anne Williams over the years. Now, I have a strange responsibility next, because I have to introduce to you somebody who I'm going to admit was not my favourite person when I was growing up, but has actually grown on me a little as I've grown older. But this is a man who, at the peak of his, if you like, fame, found a time to attend nearly every funeral related to the Hillsborough disaster, and there, in that single fact, is the measure of this man. So I introduce to you Sir Kenny Dalglish.
Thanks, Andy. It's nice to hear that from a blue. We obviously we were involved simply because of the fact that we were representing the football club that everybody, or most of the people that were there that day, also loved and cared for. And we always prided ourselves in the fact that we help each other. It's a club that's not anybody's better than anyone else. It's a club that means that they're all the same, and we all help each other in their various ways. We went along to play the game, and unfortunately, it never lasted very long because of the troubles and tribulations outside. But what I really find difficult about is, for me, the families, the people that were there, their fans were absolutely superb. The way they were caring for people who were injured, trying to lift them up into the main stand, to get them away from the crush, to run up and down with the advertising boards on the pitch to make sure that they were trying to get them some first aid. I thought the way they behaved was nothing like they were described in very shortly afterwards, local newspapers or national newspapers. And for me, I would have thought that if there was going to be any justice done, it has to be to control what is said publicly, especially immediately after the game or very close to the termination of the game, because the first impressions and first reading and first accusation was very hard then for people to go and defend it, and for a lot of people to say that they were right. To accuse our people who come along to watch the game and who'd been there the year before, where there was still a hint of problems, and they were told by our football club that there was problems the year before, could we play this game? Not back at Sheffield, but at Manchester United, and they said no. They said they don't know whether the ground would have been available or whether we could have played there. Well, it was available because we had the best chief executive that you could ever dream of, who organised it and wanted to get it organised for the fact to take the punters there. But that never came to fruition. So we went through the FA's request to have the game at a stadium where we thought was partially unsafe. Certainly experienced some trauma the year before, which wasn't really publicised. We asked to go to the other end of the ground, which is a huge cop, and they said logistically that wasn't possible. They think it would be best for the Notts Forest fans to go in there. So we were left to go to the Leppings Lane, and the way that the various departments of the establishment went about this disaster was unbelievably poor. And for me, I would agree with going forward with the Hillsborough Law, because at the end of the day, we're all equal. It doesn't matter. You might have a better job than someone else. You might have more wealth than someone else, which might afford you to dodge the law. But everybody should be given the same opportunity to defend themselves, to get some proper justice done for them when they go to court. The fact that you can't afford to pay for an expensive lawyer, which are usually the best ones, doesn't mean to say that you're guilty. The guilt should be there on what you've done, and what they did was atrocious. And the way that they handled everything afterwards, in terms of changing the statements, putting everybody's time of death at 3:15, when Andrew Devine was a victim there as well, and he lasted what, another 20 odd years, 32 years. He lasted since Hillsborough. So how could he possibly have said that? And I think the only way that you're going to get anything done properly is to make sure that everybody is given an equal opportunity to do it. At the inquest, where I attended one of the inquests at Warrington, and so the justice that they wanted, the justice they deserved, and the people, the families have acted brilliantly. They've been an absolute credit to the city of Liverpool, to the families that they represent, and for everything that they've done. And if the people on the other side had behaved as diligently and as well and as honestly as the families, then I think they would have been very embarrassed. So they told tale after tale, lie after lie, and at the moment we've got as far as we possibly can get, I would have thought. And to take this on, the Hillsborough Law did as much as they possibly could to try and ease the pain a little, if they possibly could. And as I say, I think that's what you do as a humane person. That's the way I was brought up when I was a kid. You respect the environment, you respect the establishment. By the way, you can't have that respect now. Everybody is absolutely equal, irrespective of your colour, creed, religion, financial status, whatever. And you should be given the same access to public funds as what those people are given. Just because they work for the government doesn't mean to say they should get preferential treatment. Don't we all work for the government? Aren't we all paying taxes and everything else? So why, because in the way of life, should they get preferential treatment? I don't know. But let's hope this is successful. And to everybody that's made a contribution, and after watching Anne on television, which was quite difficult at times to watch, but for everybody that's made a contribution, let's hope we can all help. And the most important thing is, let's hope, let's hope we have done and we will do, stick together, be totally supportive for the families that are there, that even up to now might need our support. We're there whenever you want us. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kenny. And I think your point about everyone should be equal under the law is exactly why we need this reform now. It's a bit bizarre because we had a blue introducing a red, and now we've got a red introducing a blue. A man who has an affinity in both sides, both camps, in the two great cities of Liverpool and Manchester. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce personally, he's here with us, who'll come to the lectern now, Peter Reid.
15th of April 1989, I was playing for QPR against Middlesbrough. Half time, I was told the news I was coming out of Hillsborough. Second half didn't mean much. That week, me and Nigel Spackman, teammate, flew up, seen Kenny, went to Anfield, seen a tribute, red and blue. That'll stay with me for the rest of my life. Let you into a secret. I was a Liverpoolian as a lad. I could have been there. If I wasn't all right at football, I could have been there watching that game. Why did the families have to go through what they had to go through? Why were briefings, sound bites from the press about Liverpool fans' behaviour? Why were they allowed to do it? Why were lies portrayed by police, government, and mainstream media? Why? Why did the families have to go through heartbreak, not being able to grieve properly because of the injustice? I watched the programme, and like many of you, moving, heartbreaking, but then anger came out of me. Anger. Why? Why was this allowed to happen? Why the years of torment, heartbreak? Why? You know what? In a civilized society, justice should be a given. A given. That's why Hillsborough Law now is essential. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much indeed, Peter. I remember you scoring for Everton at Hillsborough in 1988, January. And I remember being in the Leppings Lane that day and coming out of the ground after a late equaliser and saying to my dad and my brother, all of us suffering because of the pressure we've been under, that we'd never go again in that ground. And yet the authorities let people go into that dangerous ground for years afterwards. And that's why change is needed, to put the interests of ordinary working people first, not last, and makes the country, as Peter said, where justice is a given. It was just before the 20th anniversary of Hillsborough when I was thinking about how I would approach it and what I would say, and I read an article in The Guardian about statements, police statements, being amended, rewritten to portray the fans in a bad light. And I rang Maria Eagle, who we'll hear from later, and said, is this something, Maria, that we can do something with? Should we call for disclosure? And we did, in advance of the 20th anniversary and then afterwards. So in many ways, everything that came after the 20th anniversary, you could say that that article was the catalyst. We've heard today from politicians, we've heard from eminent lawyers, but now we're about to hear from, I would say, one of, if not the leading investigative journalist in the country. Great honor today to introduce my friend to you all, David Conn.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's obviously a privilege and also humbling to be included in the event and in a list of speakers on this scale, as well as Charlotte, Jenny, Margaret, and the families whose I mean, people who talk about, you know, that the families campaign. This is this kind of twin aspect of these awful disasters, is that we're seeing so much of the worst of our country, and the families themselves, the victims of the Hillsborough disaster, were smeared in the way that Sir Kenny was talking about, with those appalling, toxic lies that were told about them. But it was always very, very clear to me from the very, very first time that I ever met my first bereaved family, who were Phil and Hilda Hammond, whose son Philip, who was 14, was one of the 97 unlawfully killed at Hillsborough, that the families actually embody the best of us. And that's something that you've said repeatedly, Andy, because what you could see so clearly, and what you can still see now, 33 years later, is that how much they loved their loved ones, whether it was their children, as tragically it was for so many, or their parents, as it tragically was for Charlotte, and actually many others. There are many people who lost their parents at Hillsborough, and their fight, or what they've embodied through all these years, has been the love that people have for their families and the loyalty that they have to them to keep going for so long, and the determination. And along with all the other injustices that have been highlighted, there are some really core injustices, which I'm just going to try to make, say, 3 or 4 quite simple points here that, for me, are kind of the context that frame some of the detail of the injustice that you're trying to put right with the Hillsborough Law. And this first one is just that people who've lost their loved ones just should not be put through another ordeal. They just should not have to fight so hard, just as Charlotte was saying, for the truth, for the basic facts. And obviously at Hillsborough, they were fighting lies, really terrible lies that were told immediately, and as by the police force that was responsible. And as we know, it was to avoid responsibility, and not only to avoid responsibility, but to blame the very people, the victims, of their own gross negligence. And so if something like that has happened, which obviously should never happen, then people can only go to the legal system for redress, and that is where truth and justice are supposed to be established. And I think one really important context to put is that we're talking here about the establishment, about these processes, about judges, about hearings, and it can all seem very remote. And when you're sitting in the court hearings, which obviously I've done extensively over the last almost 10 years, it is so remote from people. And I've thought so many times, this is actually our legal system. As Kenny was just saying, it's not the Crown anymore. We don't live in a monarchy in that sense. We live in a democracy. The legal system is our legal system. It's the people's, it's the family's legal system. And to see them pushed to the side so many times in these court processes has felt in itself another really core injustice from which other injustices flow. And then the other points from the Hillsborough history, which still are just so shocking, are that if you look at where we ended up with the 2 criminal cases, which came after the 2016 verdicts of unlawful killing and the Liverpool supporters having had no conduct which contributed to the disaster whatsoever, and that the disaster was unlawful killing caused by gross negligence manslaughter to a criminal standard of proof by the police officer in charge. And it was a high point, obviously, for the family's campaign. It was a high point. It felt like a high point for justice, that here we've seen British justice working. It was an almighty battle against the lies, which meant that it took 2 years and was the longest case ever in British history. But it felt at times in the inquest that, well, this is British justice working because the families do have exceptional funding that Theresa May was part of making sure was maintained and did happen. And for the first time, the families had a battalion of lawyers, enough lawyers led by great lawyers like Pete Weatherby to fight their case, and therefore we got a truthful verdict. And you sat there day after day, and you can see so clearly that this was the truth. And that's another thing that I think is really clear, that there isn't really any controversy about it. They just were lies. Like when you sat there, it's all on film. We sat there day after day in Warrington, and they're showing BBC footage in colour of what happened. And you can see the supporters helping. You can see the police operation being in chaos. You can see that it's a crushing disaster. It's not, there's no misbehaviour outside. You can't see any drunkenness. You can't see a single person carrying a drink. And the jury came to the absolutely right decision on the basis of what they've been watching and seeing and listening to for 2 years. But then, as Jenny said, we then went to the Crown Court in Preston for David Duckenfield to be prosecuted for what he appeared to have admitted to in Warrington on oath. And this is, I think, a really core issue. The facts and the truth that had been established, just, they're not sacred in court. You start again from scratch in a new adversarial process, a new live adversarial process, in which the truths that have been established before have to be completely ignored, and we're not allowed to report on them, because it can prejudice the jury if you report on the truth that has been established in a court 3 years earlier. And the same lies were reintroduced into that court. And then what we've ended up with is an outcome from, excuse me, from a 32-year, as it was, struggle, which is, as Jenny said, a finding by an inquest about the 97 were unlawfully killed due to gross negligence manslaughter by David Duckenfield to a criminal standard of proof. But when he was prosecuted in a criminal court for the exact same offence, he was acquitted. You have nobody held accountable for the deaths for 97 people unlawfully killed. You've also had, if not a cover-up proven, which I'm sure everybody speaking would argue that the cover-up, it was proven to be a cover-up. You've certainly had a concerted police case completely disbelieved by an inquest jury. And yet there's nobody held accountable either for that, for police evidence having been found to have been lies, for what most people consider to be a huge cover-up. Nobody held accountable. And we've had two of these, the Hillsborough history has two of these episodes where the very first inquiry, the Taylor inquiry, came to this truthful view that the disaster was caused by police mismanagement and that the supporters, there were false accusations against the supporters. Yet it went to the first inquest and they could completely ignore that again. And they came to a miscarriage of justice that forced the families to fight against it and spend all that time and all that trauma and go through all that pain for 20 years to try and overturn something that Lord Justice Taylor had already said before was completely false. And that's another point, besides the fact then that the facts don't seem to be sacred. They can be established in one arena, the Taylor inquiry, thrown out at the inquest. Then they can be re-established again in 2012, re-established in 2016, and then thrown out again as recently as last year, sitting through these trials where we're starting again. The families are having to start again and listen to it all. And as well as that, I'd just like to make another point, which is I really, really do think that institutionalizing the legal system is, it really, really takes too long to recognize its mistakes. That these miscarriages of justice, these injustices, these mistakes, they're really, really obvious to everybody. And if you've got all the families in a concerted way having to fight together and saying there's been a cover-up and saying there's been an injustice, they wouldn't do that unless they firmly believed that there was. It was obvious. It went against the Taylor inquiry, the Taylor report. it was a very obvious miscarriage of justice, the first inquest, 1991. And yet it still took 21 years for that to be recognised, and it was refused in 1993. And it was really, really good to see the Anne drama concentrate on that and show that there was this opportunity in 1993 to put it right, which judges refused, and which consigned the families to another 20 years of campaigning. So obviously the reforms that you are proposing for the Hillsborough Law look very, very progressive and important. And to be honest, it's really shocking, because you were first talking about that in 2016 at that high point of the Hillsborough inquest, and it's really shocking to see that no progress has been made on these sensible reforms, and the government hasn't even responded to Bishop James's report that was literally commissioned by the government. And so they look like, obviously, sensible and progressive reforms that would make a real difference, that everyone should support. But I think that there's also a case for a wider look at some bigger reforms, and as Jenny said, for all the processes not to be so separate, going from one to another, that can lead to a justice outcome then being overturned by the next process. So thank you very much for inviting me. Obviously, salute to all the families and the usual admiration that we all have for them. And it was great to see ITV giving so much prime time to celebrating this, which what they were celebrating in Anne Williams, as Anne shared with all the families, which is that she fought that fight out of love and loyalty for her son.
Thanks, David, and thanks for your series of articles which expose the lies, the deceit, the untruths and the misinformation around Hillsborough. And so from somebody who did all of that to somebody who actually exposed the truth about Hillsborough as early as 1999 in a book called Hillsborough, The Truth. It's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Phil Scraden.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Andy. I want to start by saying that the drama documentary is a fitting tribute to Anne and her family, who campaigned relentlessly for justice for her son, Kevin. The performances, most notably Maxine Peake and Stephen Walters, are outstanding. And it is a profoundly moving account of the pain, the endurance and resilience experienced by all families of the 97 who died, those who died prematurely, and those who have survived. As many of you are aware, my direct involvement with Hillsborough began weeks after the disaster, when 3 families walked into my office at work. And as a consequence, I approached the Liverpool City Council to fund a proposal for what was called then the Hillsborough Project. We published 2 detailed research reports, Hillsborough and After in 1990, and No Last Rights in 1995. We published a further report for the Home Office in 1997. These reports delivered 192 recommendations, supported by 640 pages of detailed analysis. They were shelved. In late 1996, I met with a former South Yorkshire police officer who showed me 3 versions of his formal statement. Each had been reviewed and altered by senior officers. With him, I presented his evidence to the Stuart Smith scrutiny. I also accompanied 13 families to that scrutiny. Our evidence was dismissed as irrelevant. In 1998, I was so concerned about this that I managed to access all the police documents in all their forms, reviewed and altered. And they formed the foundation of the book, Hillsborough, The Truth. A decade passed when Andy made his commitment to the bereaved and survivors. I drafted the proposal that led to the Hillsborough Independent Panel, and I headed the research team, working very closely alongside. That report was presented to the bereaved and survivors in the cathedral. I want to pay tribute at this point to a researcher that I worked so closely with through that time, and who had worked on Jimmy McGovern's film. She was a colleague and a friend, and she died prematurely. The campaigns was cemented in the outcome of the Truth Recovery Panel's work in the north of Ireland. I was one of a three-person panel appointed to work with victims and survivors of the mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries, and workhouses. Last October, we published our report. Its 5 primary recommendations, embodying 87 subsidiary findings, have now been accepted in full by all parties in the Northern Ireland Government Assembly. At its heart will be an independent panel with a range of specialist expertise to which survivors, families, and others involved in the process can present their evidence in person or in writing. They will not endure any form of cross-examination of that evidence. That panel's work will inform and overlap with a full statutory public inquiry. Its terms of reference derived in the evidence presented by families to the panel. Those giving written or oral evidence on behalf of religious or non-statutory organisations or state departments will be subject to a duty of candour. As in the Hillsborough panel, the process will be supported by an independent research team. This integrated truth investigation, overseen by victims and survivors, begins its work in the spring. It will be the first integrated, fully funded process of its kind internationally. It will ensure open access to all institutional records, and it will establish schemes for redress, reparation, and memorialization. Yes, the Hillsborough Law is an important step towards achieving full transparency. Integrating an independent expert panel with a statutory public inquiry involving the bereaved and survivors at every stage constitutes a further advance in future processes aiming to secure truth and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. And as Steve said, Professor Phil Scraton established the truth many years before. And the question is, why didn't politicians act? And that's a question for Parliament as it considers the timing of introducing a Hillsborough Law, because Parliament didn't act. In fact, the cover-up over Hillsborough was perpetrated in the committee rooms of Parliament. And that's why there are deep lessons to be learned for all politicians. But as Margaret said, some did more than others, and some, when the moment came, provided support. And that was certainly the case for me after the 20th anniversary of Hillsborough, when I asked for our next speaker's support. When I asked, it was there. And that really mattered to me hugely. It is amazing that we've got 2 former prime ministers today. That very rarely happens an event like this, but it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend and the former Prime Minister of this country, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown.
Let me first of all pay tribute to the perseverance, the patience, and most of all the dignity of all Hillsborough families who suffered such a grievous loss, a loss that I know will never leave you as long as you live. And it is to respect and honour the memory of all who died that we need the Hillsborough Law now. No delays, no prevarications, no excuses, to secure justice for you and everyone who in future may face the same challenges. And I'm here to speak with Andy Burnham, Steve Rutherford, members of the panel, actors, the Hillsborough families, support groups, and all the families themselves. And not just because Liverpool and Scotland have the strongest connections, because as Prime Minister with Andy, I ordered the creation of the independent panel under Bishop Jones. And I want to say with all who speak today that no one should ever have to go through what Hillsborough families have had to live through. No one should be denied the truth as you were denied the truth. No one should have had to wait so long to be heard as you waited so long. No one should be kept in the dark by bureaucratic indifference and deceitful lies like your families were kept in the dark. No group of families should ever again have to walk alone. I say that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And to protect all and all in future, we need that Hillsborough Law now. A new legal duty of candour, and that means no cover-ups, no concealments, no closing of ranks, proper legal representation for families in the event of a public disaster, a charter for families bereaved and your rights that guarantee publicly funded participation of bereaved families at inquests, a public accountability law that requires not just disclosure, but obliges the authorities, indeed compels police, courts, governments to proactively explain what they have done, omitted to do, and failed to do. And what was proposed first by Michael Wills and taken forward by Maria Eagle, the creation of an institutionalized, independent, adequately resourced advocate for the bereaved to act as representative, advisor, and support, and to secure the transparent flow of information that in the Hillsborough case was too long delayed and denied. So that with these new acts of Parliament, we ensure that the law stands up for the public interest, not for vested interests, for justice, not just the status quo, so that no one facing tragedy, as Hillsborough families face tragedy, will ever again walk alone.
Thanks, Gordon. Andy mentioned certain politicians who do more than others. My next contributor is somebody who was elected to Parliament in 1987, so was there as our representative of what happened when the Hillsborough disaster actually struck, and did represent us fantastically well. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Maria Eagle MP.
Thanks, Steve. My involvement in the fight for Hillsborough Truth and Justice goes back almost 30 years. I got to know some of the Hillsborough families and campaigners as a junior solicitor in the early 1990s during the civil proceedings that were happening then. Following my election to the House of Commons in 1997, I've campaigned for truth and justice on behalf of some of my constituents who are families and survivors for almost 25 years. By the middle of last year, after 32 and a half years, the unlawful killing of 97 wholly innocent children, women, and men by the gross negligence of the South Yorkshire Police at Hillsborough, all remaining criminal trials against those responsible, collapsed without anyone being held to account. And I believe this represents a gross failure of our entire legal system, because this disaster was carried live on TV. You could see what was happening in the films, and the Taylor inquiry set out accurately that the police were mainly to blame within 4 months of those events. So why did it take 23 years and the publication of the work of the Hillsborough Independent Panel, which in truth was an accident of history? It was an accident that we managed to get the panel going, really, Andy. It wasn't something that was inevitable. So why did it take all that time for the truth that had been accepted by Taylor within 4 months to be told and accepted in full by the legal and political establishment? And why did it take 27 years for the correct inquest verdicts of unlawful killing? We've got to stop that happening ever again, and we've got to learn the lessons to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So now is the time for legislative change. Now is the time. Because although Hillsborough is an exceptionally bad case, you can see the trends of lies and obfuscation and blame deflecting in other examples of disasters. So I agree very much with the Hillsborough Law, with the equality of arms at inquests, with the statutory duty of candour, and the Justice Select Committee, of which I'm a member, has made some additional recommendations about the availability of legal aid in this regard. But I think more is needed. Hillsborough shows that attempted cover-ups have got to be torpedoed at an early stage to prevent what happened to the Hillsborough families from happening to others caught up in public disasters. And that's where Lord Michael Wills and I and our Public Advocate Bill comes in. We've introduced it into the Commons and into the Lords and have been doing so since 2015. And it does two crucial things. It gives families agency. Too often, families caught up in disasters through no fault of their own are done to by the system. They just happen to be there. They're not central to what's going on, and they ought to be. The Public Advocate Bill would make families central to what was going on, because they could decide between themselves whether or not they wanted the public advocate to be involved. The public advocate's job would then be to do what the Hillsborough independent panel did at a very early stage of proceedings. The panel it was 23 years later, they had to look at 500,000 documents and sort through it all. If you did that process at a much earlier stage, you could stop things going wrong. The only way of stopping Hillsborough happening again, and what happened there with the cover-ups and the lies, is by stopping things going wrong in the first place. And the Public Advocate Bill, by shining the light of transparency at an early stage on what is happening, would torpedo any attempt at cover-ups and would stop things going so horrifically wrong. So I believe that that is an essential part of the changes that we have to make, following on from the final ending of the court cases surrounding Hillsborough almost 32 and a half years after the events, and so long after it was accepted by the public inquiry what had gone wrong. Between all of us in Parliament, campaigning outside of Parliament, we can make this happen. The government are now having to consider what they should do about Bishop James Jones's report, which we've heard about today. They will be making decisions. So all of us, inside and outside Parliament, can campaign now to get the Hillsborough Law, to make these changes so that the families who've had to go through so much can finally have recognition that their fight has not been in vain. They may not have got all that they wanted. They've achieved the truth being accepted. They have a measure of justice in the inquest verdicts, but they've never had accountability for what went wrong. Nobody has been held to account. They will know, if we get the Hillsborough Law, that this is a monument to their fight, to their campaign, and it will stop what has happened to them ever happening to any other families bereaved by public disasters. And I think that that will be a fitting memorial to their lost loved ones, and it will make them understand the monumental nature of their achievement, tough as it has been after all these years, to get to the truth, to fight off the establishment and the lies. And I think we have to do it. We've got to persuade the government to do it. And I think we can.
Thanks, Maria, and apologies for putting 10 years on your parliamentary career, but you did stand up for us, and when I wasn't there and lots of others weren't, it was you and Derek Twigg and others were the voices that I wanted. Our next contributor is somebody who again supported me when I was in Parliament, and Andy Burnham and Maria and others as we tried to progress things, and also supported the families, giving them advice and guidance and support, always for nothing. But it's Charlie Faulkner, Lord Charlie Faulkner, who's speaking to us next.
Indeed, Steve, it's a real privilege to be here speaking on behalf of the need for the changes in the law. By a million miles, the most impressive supporters of the change in the law are the Hillsborough families, who have gone through an unimaginable hell. It is so good to see Margaret Aspinall, Jenny Hicks, Charlotte Hennessey, Steve Kelly speaking today. I, over a 40-year period in the law, have trusted the law, but the law deserves absolutely no trust whatsoever in relation to what happened in the Hillsborough case. The extraordinary thing about it is that people kept going for 33 years. They did not get justice. Truth came out, but no justice. The law, in effect, damaged and destroyed people it was supposed to protect, and it utterly ravaged and vilified families for fighting for who are fighting for justice, and in particular allowed the police to tell lies and assert terrible dishonesties successfully for decades, and the law allowed it. As Maria and others have said, Lord Justice Taylor's report within months revealed the massive police negligence that had caused the disaster and completely exonerated the fans. Then for months and months and months, a terrible first inquest went on in which the police repeated and repeated lies about the fans that in effect completely infected the whole narrative and led to a travesty of a verdict of accidental death. Nothing was done about that for years. The higher courts rejected appeals. The Stuart Smith review, in effect, exonerated the process. And there were only a moment of justice because of Bishop James's inquiry, to which Phil Scraton played such an important part. And that wasn't the law. That was something separate from the law. The second inquest then came back with the verdicts of unlawful killing. And as so many people have said this afternoon, all of those gains were then simply rubbished away in the criminal trials that subsequently followed. So the truth came out, but absolutely nothing was done about it in order to give justice. The need for a change in the law is absolutely vital. And the three things that absolutely stand out about what happened is, first of all, the total inequality of arms as between the publicly funded public sector organizations who had legal representation coming out of their ears. And it was only when the families were properly represented at the second inquests that justice, or not justice, the truth came out at that point. Secondly, the duty of candor. The police could deliberately pursue a series of lies to try to muddy the waters, which they very successfully did. And thirdly, there was nobody to speak for the families throughout that whole period. There's a terrible story that Margaret Aspinall tells of before the first inquest. A QC says, well, you can have me, not me, but the QC who was talking, a Rolls Royce, or this other chap, pointed to some other lawyer who is a Mini. And they had no money, so they had to have the Mini and not the Rolls Royce. Whereas all the police and other representatives had Rolls Royces driving around in the courtroom. The law really, really failed the families. The families continued to fight, partly because they were supported by the city of Liverpool, partly because the Liverpool Football Club was incredibly supportive throughout, but above all, because they were brave and incredibly well led. But other groups should not have to go through what they went through. So the time has come. In fact, the time has come and passed for a change in the law. I strongly support the change in the law that Andy and Steve are arguing for, and it cannot come soon enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Charlie, as ever, on robust form. And you helped us all so much through the second inquest, and we'll always be grateful to you for your advice as we went through that. Now we're going to turn to some other events that, as I said before, have the same thread running through. And we're going to bring it up to the present day now, because many of us recognised as soon as the fire at Grenfell Tower happened, there were appalling echoes of Hillsborough, and we knew the Grenfell families would need support. I remember going with Margaret to West London and sitting down and providing what we could in those early days. And we've continued to provide full support and solidarity to Grenfell United. So it's a great pleasure that from London, joining us today, from Grenfell United, Adel Shoei. Adel.
So, thanks for the invite, everybody. I just wanted to start with how Grenfell differs and benefited in part from what the Grenfell law would mean. Now, unlike the struggle faced by Hillsborough families, the very public and shocking image of a residential tower in the very centre of our nation's capital, with images beamed around the world, of 72 men, women and children incinerated, meant after an initial period of shock and inaction by central government, a decision was made to grant Grenfell families exceptional legal funding, which during our inquiries enabled legal representatives first time round to shine a slow but much more rapid light on failings. And this is a huge contrast to the decades-long fight experienced by the families of Hillsborough and others. We're only partway through the inquiry, let alone the start of any criminal proceedings. Now, I've mentioned this to highlight the indefensible and unjust position of on the one hand, one rule for Grenfell, because we're absurdly lucky to see the very public and internationally reported deaths of our loved ones, and on the other, the rule for everyday families up and down the country having to fend for themselves and experience what should be a fair and impartial justice system heavily skewed by bodies able to spend their way out of accountability. Again, we're only partway through discovering the shameful and corrupt actions that surround Grenfell. This sort of parity of arms is a useful contrast to experiences of other affected families and damning evidence for why the Hillsborough Law is so necessary. And this leads me to where our experiences match other families, and that is the complete lack of any duty of candor. Again, parity of arms, it kind of helps to check somewhat, as does freedom of information, which wasn't available to Hillsborough families. But because we're accessing central government funding rather than budgets from the police force, if it were the police force or whoever, we still see those bodies defending the indefensible rather than cutting their losses. The amount of amnesia we've seen, or even undeclared evidence being discovered during the inquiry, would all be laughed off as fanciful conspiracy if it were a film. However, what it shows is that the fine-tuning structure of justice in the UK is simply not balanced fairly between everyday victims and what are effectively much richer suspects or even perpetrators responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. In a few cases, however, the absurd luck surrounding the deaths of our loved ones tempered the candor of some public bodies and individuals. But as we've seen during the Hillsborough trials, this is because obviously we're still only in our inquiry. Without a duty of candor, evidence was still shown as fact despite being discredited, leading first to a mistrial and then to an acquittal. Grenfell families are very aware of this and the risks any absence of candor has on holding people accountable for the deaths of our loved ones. Now, just like shameful claims of drunk, rowdy Scousers being responsible for the deaths of Hillsborough, almost 33 years ago, There are parallel, shameful claims by some media outlets that residents were responsible for the fire at Grenfell, ignoring the fact that a high-rise residential tower had, in effect, been allowed to be insulated and clad in solidified petroleum. But parity of arms and freedom of information doesn't extend to private bodies like Arconics, Celotex, Kingspan or Rydham, who despite damning evidence remain bullish, demanding evidential protection against prosecution and in some cases refusing to even give evidence. For us, this is a key part of the proposed Hillsborough Law. If you're happy to accept and profit from taxpayer public money, you must accept the same public body responsibility and accountability. That means freedom of information and all that it entails in the Hillsborough Law. And now we feel the bonfire regulations played a major factor in the deaths of our loved ones, all to help business. And the belief being that markets and private bodies will be cheaper and better. By subjecting private bodies that accept the benefits of public cash to the Hillsborough Law, the same market-based thinking would mean markets would make a level-headed, business-sensible decision to cut their losses and not defend an indefensible position, simply because they can spend their way out of accountability, causing years of pain and suffering and generations still fighting for justice for their ancestors and a huge cost to taxpayers. I spoke a few times about the absurdity of luck, and there are many tragic stories behind Grenfell, but I was urged to humanize those stories with a brief summary, personal loss. Of a young, hopeful for the future family of 5, a father discovered within reach of his wife, found a few steps away cradling their 6-month-old baby, but unable to know that their 2 primary-age children had been discovered alive and rushed to the hospital. Only for the oldest child, still only 8, to die in the arms of people who love her a mere 24 hours later. Now, despite the absurdity of luck, we're truly grateful for our sole survivor. But Grenfell United, supported by her friends from Hillsborough and all around the country, are adamant she will not have to fight for the future, for future accountability and justice, like too many families continue to do or will never see. So in conclusion, with all due respect, while it's very welcome, a public advocate only partially papers over injustices. Like Margaret, Grenfell United demands a Hillsborough Law as the only legacy that can truly fine-tune justice and right wrongs that continue to be perpetrated. It's time to level up and turn, It's time to level up and turn the shameful page on a history of injustice that's favoured free spending haves at the expense of everyday, ordinary people. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Adele. Really harrowing testimony there. What I think has happened is that you've got injustices happening even as recently as 2017. And we're going to go from fairly recently all the way back now to probably 70 years nearly ago with the nuclear test veterans. And it was a great pleasure for myself and Andy to have met with Susie Boniface and some nuclear test veterans just a few weeks ago. And again, their stories is something that, while Susie's done a brilliant job to try to get the reality of what happened all those years ago out, I don't think many people fully appreciate just how badly these people were treated. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce from the Daily Mirror, Susie Boniface.
Thanks for asking me to be here, and thank you all for fighting for the truth. What you are doing here today and starting is beyond price. I'm here to introduce you to someone who embodies a scandal you probably haven't heard of. It's a story that starts in 1952, 70 years ago this year, when Britain detonated its first atomic weapon. And what he has to say is probably going to shock you. But when you hear him speak, I'd like you to think about something. I've been reporting on stories like his for 20 years. The Mirror's been campaigning about it for more than 30 years. And in that time, there have been hundreds, thousands of people who've come to us telling exactly the same story that you will hear today. So I'd like you to multiply what he says by 22,000. That's the number of people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of them was Sarah Brown's granddad. The British government ordered them to be there. They faced jail if they refused. Could you then multiply that by a further 155,000? That's the number of people who weren't there and were instead, like the man you'll hear from next, the children and grandchildren of those who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And finally, could you multiply all of that by 500? That's the number of years scientists tell us that we can expect to see the genetic consequences of what happened. And because they were, like so many others who've spoken today, the wrong sort of people, when they complain to the government, they are lied to. They were and are misled, belittled, denigrated, and forced into expensive and drawn-out legal battles that they cannot hope to win without the evidence that is withheld from them by the state that harmed them. This is a scandal without end, a story that is so far without a resolution. Andy and Steve have joined with the Mirror for a final push in this anniversary year for justice, for restitution and reparation of the truth about our nuclear weapons tests. The Hillsborough family's great victory and the great battle that's still facing the other families who are speaking today lies in restoring our nation's sense of moral balance. We stand with you in seeking the reforms needed by a Hillsborough Law now, and we ask you to do the same and stand with the survivors of Britain's Cold War radiation experiments. Steve, over to you.
Thank you. I've been truly shocked to hear just how comprehensively the systems of the British state have been used against those it should have protected. I think the fact that two former prime ministers are here proves that we need a law to keep the machinery of state working for us, not against us. I am humbled by the dedication of the Hillsborough family and proud for all our sakes that you have restored what was always the truth. I'm here to tell you about a different scandal. Governments have been sweeping people like me under the carpet for 70 years. My late father, David Pearce, was an RAF officer in charge of the airfield at Maralinga in South Australia. Britain used it to detonate 7 nuclear weapons and carry out 593 plutonium experiments between 1953 and 1963, when my dad was there. I was born 10 years afterwards, with shortened limbs, hydrocephalus, a curved spine, and one leg bent about 45 degrees the wrong way, and doctors are unable to diagnose my condition. There are 155,000 descendants of our atomic veterans who report 10 times the number of birth defects, missing teeth, extra teeth, giant limbs, deformed organs, childhood cancers, S-shaped bones, miscarriages, and infertility. Successive governments have refused to study our health and concentrated the massive resources of the state in a strategy of delay, deny, until we die. Millions of taxpayer pounds have been spent fighting war pensions and court claims. Our dad's medical records have had pages ripped out and false information has been given. That is a crime. We have proof our dads were ordered to sail, fly, and crawl through radioactive fallout. Yet the MOD has said for 7 decades that no one was in danger, that internal contamination was not possible. My dad told me how the safety measures at Maralinga were basically a wire fence separating the test areas from the rest. Yet the wind blew contaminated sand onto every surface, every cup, every meal. Nowhere was safe. We have MOD documents saying men would have their blood tested. We have witnesses who say their blood was taken. Today, the government refuses to show us those records. In 2009, the MOD admitted that about 10% of the men were probably exposed to radiation. The men it had been calling liars for more than half a century. In 2018, they said they'd look at a medal. And in 2020, said that there was not enough risk involved even for that. The state took our health and is withholding the one thing we want, the truth. My conditions cannot be cured, but I can live with them. There are many veterans, children and grandchildren who could not. Disease, deformity, and in some cases suicide have taken them from us. Of the 22,000 who served at Britain's 45 nuclear bomb tests and the minor trials, fewer than 3,000 now remain. Many died from cancers and other conditions that can be linked to radiation. We have had press attention, we have had political support, but both have waned, with the exception of the Daily Mirror, which has campaigned for justice since the 1980s. Only our fears have grown. For most of my life, I did not want to father children, in case I passed on whatever is wrong with my DNA. However, I fell in love. Then 2 years ago, got married, and in May last year, welcomed my son Sasha, a bonny, healthy boy. As he grows up, I'll be watching him through the eyes of my father, worrying that radiation will find a way through. My son deserves to know the truth. He deserves to see his grandfather's full medical records. And above all, I want him to grow up in a world where officials do not use all the resources at their disposal to delay, deny, and wait for the truth to die. Thank you for your time.
Steve, thank you, Susie, as well. As I said before, this is the 70th anniversary year, and this should be the year where we all resolve to end a 70-year cover-up, because that's what it is. One of the biggest injustices that this country has not yet faced up to. And remember, these are people who served our country overseas in those years following the Second World War. And this is how we treat them. And we see the effects on their families that continue to this day. This is the year we look them in the eye. And as Steve said, look me in the eye, we will. And I call on everybody to do that. This is the year this injustice ends. Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Steve. Turning to another issue now with an anniversary year, the 5th anniversary. I know that people in this city will never ever forget the night of the 22nd of May, 2017. Hard to believe it's almost 5 years. And we made a commitment that we would support the families bereaved on that night, those injured, all the way through. It's hard to imagine, actually, what they've gone through in that time and continue to go through. Every day is painful to them. We know that the inquest is ongoing at the moment, and we continue to support them through that. And actually, changes have been made following Hillsborough, and it's important to recognise that today. It's not all doom and gloom. The Manchester Arena inquiry is different because of the fight of the Hillsborough families. Those 22 young people have been placed at the heart of that inquiry, and that is something. There is progress, but would you believe there is still an echo of Hillsborough in this inquiry too? And to talk to you about that, I'm pleased to introduce to you the mother of Chloe Rutherford from the North East. Over to you, Lisa Rutherford. Lisa.
Afternoon. Thank you very much for having us today. Lisa Rutherford, as Andy's just said, Chloe Rutherford's mum, who was 17 when she died at the Manchester Arena bombing. Joined together here with Caroline Curry, Liam's mum, who was Chloe's boyfriend, and obviously they died together. The truth equals change. That's what we would like to put forward. Bereaved families must come first. Accountability must happen. This is our thoughts and opinions, and obviously this is just for me and Caroline today. We are here today to explain how we feel like collateral damage in a process. Our kids went to a concert and didn't come home. And I understand this is the same for your loved ones. They went to the football match and they didn't come home. The similarities that we can see through reading Bishop James Jones' report and watching the Anne programme, which everybody has watched this week, have really made us worry and cement the parallels we can see between Hillsborough's inquest and the Manchester Arena inquiry. Andy has helped me to see this very clearly. There are some aspects that have been improved, as Andy said. Now we have looked after, personally, while having to be in Manchester, we were looked after very well at such an awful time. The amazing way in which our kids' belongings were cared for with total empathy, I know is very different to what you suffered. And we are also very grateful for the work that you have done to allow us to have pen portraits at the beginning of our inquiry, to be able to tell our story with our kids. And we would like to say, thank you that something has been achieved, really. However, as Andy said, there are many parallels we can see. We feel like an insignificant cog in a huge wheel. We have sat at the back of court every day, including the trial, for just on 2 years now. And we were told lots and lots that families come first. But the fact that companies can say whatever they want, truth or lies, and we are expected to sit and listen, knowing the truth is not being told without any compassion or care for the families at all, is a very difficult one to take. The Kerslake report should have been a huge help to find out the truth of what actually happened as early as possible. Instead, some of this report was just made up by professional people who should have known better. How can we learn if the truth is not told, let alone the disrespect to us and yourselves, the family? I totally understand human error, but we entered into this process thinking it was a fact-finding process to help others so that this does not happen again. But unfortunately, we've ended up in a place where we've had to really dig for the truth, and we find it quite disgusting. Caroline.
Almost 5 years ago, I was told that Liam needed a post-mortem. I asked that Liam wasn't given a post-mortem because they knew how Liam had died. So I didn't see that there was any need to have a post-mortem. However, I was told quite forcibly that that decision was out of my hands. Liam was a crime scene and therefore did not belong to me at that time. So therefore they would do a post-mortem. I know that my mind's gone blank. Yeah. So many professional bodies and companies have come into court wanting to pass on their condolences to us as families, when they've had nearly 5 years to do this directly, but chose not to. We don't want their condolences 5 years on. What we want is the truth, so that lessons can be learned, practices rectified, and no other family needs to walk in our shoes ever again. This is why the Hillsborough Law now is needed so desperately. We have read many statements since the Arena atrocity, and from reading statements and then listening to these people stand up in court, there are stark differences between the statements and then their truth or lies. There are many contradictions in these statements. All we want as families, as you yourselves wanted from your inquiries, is the truth. I think everybody can deal with anything that is thrown at them as long as we know the truth. So the Hillsborough Law now is a desperately needed law. We had to be in Manchester through this whole process. As you can appreciate, it's the worst place possible.
This is where our kids were murdered. We were going through the most horrific process. It's been very destructive and impactful on us and our whole families. Our privacy for our kids is gone. Everything is so public. Again, something I know that is so similar and is very difficult to deal with. And this has, again, a huge significant effect on, again, both ourselves and our families, extended families. More similarities. We were told while we were in the Etihad by the person that was there to help that all the bereaved had been accounted for and that the families had been told if their children or family members were deceased. Me and Caroline at that point were really relieved and expecting them to maybe be in hospital or unconscious somewhere that we weren't aware of, and they were going to be hopefully okay. But the same happened to us that happened to Anne in the documentary that we followed. This was not true. And we had our we had our hopes raised and then crashed we waited quite a little while for that, which was absolutely horrific. And that sinking feeling of hope, and then to find out actually our kids were gone, was very difficult. This is why we strongly support the proposal of the Hillsborough Law for a statutory duty of candour for when they give evidence to any form of official inquiry set up by national or local government, they tell the truth. We need to prevent bereaved families in the future to face the same long, difficult, heartbreaking search for the truth, having to challenge ourselves on all levels with years in the wilderness, like Anne Williams. The truth needs to be told at the first opportunity. Statements need to be taken as soon as physically possible and shared with who needs it to help with the learning and the change to be implemented, and then accountability needs to be endorsed. Please hold your hands up and tell the truth. We would respect you so much if you could just do that. And we can then help to make sure that other families don't have to live this hell we are living. As parents, we will never stop until we get the truth and the answers for our children. And like I said at the beginning, the truth equals change. And that's all we would like to say, and thank you again for having us today.
Thanks, Lisa. And Andy wants me to also say thanks to Caroline, who's Liam's mum, for the contribution there. As the father of two young girls who were at that concert on that night, and whose blood turned cold when I heard the news myself, my heart goes out to you both and everybody else who unfortunately lost people at that terrible tragedy. I'm going to introduce now Kai and Nicole, who lost their 7-year-old son, Zane, who was actually poisoned by toxic fumes. And they're after the truth about Zane. It's a thread that's gone through many of the contributions. I'm sure we'll hear similar sorts of stories of how things have been barriers have been put in the way of our next two contributors. Over to you, Kai and Nicole.
Spin, deception, and lies. If we're honest, this is the heart of the matter. Nicole and I come before you as grieving parents, denied all rights to truth and justice, even the right to grieve in peace. Floodwater passed through secret landfill into our Victorian flood basement, and our home was infused with nerve agent. Zane, our son, was killed. In addition to flooding, secret landfill, and nerve agent, which was the horrific hydrogen cyanide gas used to kill people in World War II gas chambers, and this was detected 3 times by expert hazmat, as stated in Freedom of Information disclosures and in many other disclosures. There were hospitals overwhelmed by unwell and evacuated people, also in Freedom of Information disclosures. And then there were expert geotechnical reports on the secret landfill 4 years before Zain was killed. And they state that there are migrating landfill gases. The risk is high and unacceptable. Investigation is required, then remediate. Now, with this forewarning, the authorities protected their own properties next door to Zain's home using gas-proof membranes so that they could not be harmed or killed, but they told no one else. What was it like for us? Well, I say watch Anne and the Salisbury poisonings and merge them. And note, Zain had no public authority sympathy from any quarter. We were attacked for daring to ask for the truth. Oh, and of course, Zain's had no justice. Imagine all that firepower against one child. There are more monsters prepared to attack children than one would imagine. Now, time is limited, and I want to touch on two aspects of Hillsborough law: candour and parity of funding. As with Hillsborough, the duty of candour was non-existent in Zain's case, despite many documents, data, facts confirming hydrogen cyanide. The multiple authorities involved denied hydrogen cyanide was ever detected. In addition, there was no proper full and fearless investigation. Zain was denied an Article 2 inquest, denied a jury. Witnesses and evidence were compromised at every level. Blame was shifted to a substance at day one, a gas that wasn't even present. And we found ourselves on trial at an inquest based on untruths. We were denied legal aid several times, whilst a phalanx of multi-billion-pound turnover authorities all had public money and legal aid for their legal teams for years, enabling the appointment of some of the best lawyers and QCs in the UK. Even the coroner had legal aid. We had to wheelchair and walk the streets, broken, to beg for money for representation at our son's inquest, nearly £80,000. Equality of arms? No. Metaphorically speaking, we had one unarmed David against multiple heavily armed Goliaths. Despite the truth being visible, the inquest acted to systematically strip Zain of his human rights using a false lens of plausible deniability. If they can do this to the 97 and their families, imagine what they can do to one family walking alone. If there is nothing for any of these authorities to hide, give Zain an independent panel inquiry with full disclosure. We are grateful for and we thank our 110,000 public petitioners, general secretaries of unions, including the Fire Brigade Union, who refuse to be complicit. Unison, Unite, PCS, CWU, NEU, TUC, and some of our cross-party leaders. Many have written to the Prime Minister asking him to give Zain an independent panel inquiry, which is how Hillsborough got the truth. The publicly elected councillors at Zain's own local authority recently unanimously voted and wrote to the Prime Minister demanding an IP for Zain. At their extraordinary meeting, they cited serious judicial failings and cover-up. We should all be able to speak truth to power and be heard. Hillsborough makes clear the truth is imperative in order that others can be protected and justice be served. The patronising disposition and disgrace of unaccountable power is neither confined to Hillsborough or the past. So we call on the government to commit to bring forward a comprehensive Hillsborough law now without further delay. For Zain, you must ask yourselves, what kind of a country do we live in where there is no investigation into hydrogen cyanide, a chemical weapon of mass destruction in a neighbourhood? I was 2 yards from Zain, unconscious. My diagnosis is paraplegia due to hydrogen cyanide poisoning. Bottom line, did Zain get a fair hearing? Answer, no. I'd like to thank you for listening and our gratitude to Andy Burnham. If the politicians on this call want to help, getting Zain an independent panel inquiry would be a good start. We have shared just the tip of the iceberg about Zain's story, but hear this. the power of love is stronger than the love of power. And I'm sure the campaigns are united on this point. Our hope is to honour Zane with truth and protect others. According to the BMJ, 80% of people in this country live within 2 kilometres of landfill. This fight is everybody's fight, and it's in the public interest. Authorities must face up to the truth and not bury it.
Little children should not be tucked up at night and fear that they will not wake up in the morning. Zane is not just a lie on a death certificate. No child was ever loved more, and we will die fighting if we have to, but please help us. Do not let history repeat itself. I do not want to die before we undo the lies that dishonour our precious little boy, so he can finally rest in peace. Zane did not die accidentally. He was unlawfully killed. The evidence is all there. Zane died and the authorities lied. Thank you all for allowing us to be Zane's voice today. Rest in peace, Zane.
Kai, Nicole, your love for your son just shines through, and obviously we see Zane there behind you. But actually the power of your words will resonate throughout the country. Steve and I were just saying, how can it be that you're still fighting? Your situation is one that requires an independent inquiry. I remember, Nicole, and we were talking to Margaret Aspinall about this, when you stood up after one of Margaret's speeches in Parliament, and you said you were in the same position. We were with you then, we're with you now, and we'll be with you always. Thank you for joining us today. I want to turn to another case that's, if you like, a case that doesn't always get the attention that others have. But this is a family that also has had to fight and fight hard and is still fighting, hasn't had justice. But I know when you hear the next speaker, you will know, like others we've heard from today, will forever fight for her brother. So I'd like to introduce to you today the brother of Yusuf Maki, the sister of Yusuf Maki, Jade Akum. Jade.
Okay. Yusuf was born in Manchester in September 2001. He was a much longed for and loved addition to our family. He and I developed an exceptionally close bond that remained throughout his life. From an early age, Yusuf showed exceptional academic ability and was encouraged by his teachers at primary school to sit the entrance exam for the Manchester Grammar School. Our hearts were bursting with pride when he was awarded a full bursary to attend one of the top schools in the country. Yusuf's future was bright. He excelled at school and achieved 10 A-star grades and was being prepped for Oxbridge. His dream was to be a heart surgeon, but Yusuf was not only gifted academically, he was also a talented sportsperson, a popular and loving friend with a personality that shone brightly. Yusuf was killed on March the 2nd, 2019 by a friend who stabbed him through the heart with a knife that had been illegally imported by another friend. I cannot put into words the devastation we felt. We loved Yusuf so much and he loved us. It was like a huge sinkhole that opened up beneath our feet and we were collapsing into the pit of hell. I would like to thank Andy for inviting us to share our story with you. I will attempt to show how the system has worked against us in our quest to get justice for Yusuf. In the months that followed Yusuf's death, we had total faith in the system and were reassured by the police and CPS that justice would be delivered. It is over 2.5 years since Yusuf died, and what we experienced has added immeasurably to our anguish and pain. I have reviewed the report and proposed charter, and so many of the details resonated with me. I've also noted that the National Police Chiefs Council have committed to the recommendations, yet our experience has and continues to be one that is frustrating and painful. From the moment Yusuf was killed by Joshua Molnar with a knife purchased by Adam Chowdhury, the wheels of justice ground to a halt. Both families are very wealthy and were able to secure teams of top barristers. Joshua Molnar had a fascination with knives and had been arrested and de-arrested just 2 weeks before killing Yusuf. This information was not disclosed at the trial, and despite any evidence to support his claim of self-defense, He was acquitted of murder and manslaughter. During the trial, we had to sit in the public gallery, unable to hear proceedings. We were denied the opportunity to provide a character reference for Yusuf. We had to listen to the prosecution assassinate his character to support their narrative. When Molnar was acquitted of both charges and before sentencing, he filmed himself in the court making stabbing motions, with drill music playing in the background, 2 flicks in my hand, let's see who bleeds. This was sent to my 15-year-old brother. Molnar has faced no charges for this. Despite being broken by the verdict, we vowed to get justice for Yusuf and have been supported by an amazing army of people. Once people hear the granular detail of what happened, they are shocked, and so many have come forward to help. We have had to rely on the generosity of our legal team and fundraise to try and move our case forward. Lucy Powell, the Labour MP for Manchester Central, took Yusuf's case to the House of Parliament to highlight the different outcomes of cases linked to class, background and wealth. Andy Burnham has also given his public support to our campaign. At every turn, as we campaign for an inquest and fundraise for a possible civil claim, the wealthy families involved use their privilege. The Molnars employed a PR company, securing an article in the Sunday Times when Josh turned 18, and the Chowdhury family went to the High Court to try and prevent Adam being named as he approached this milestone birthday. The Charter in its current state is for families bereaved by public tragedy. I'm not sure if Yusuf's death falls under this banner, but I believe the principles of the Charter should apply in all deaths when public bodies are involved. Our objective is to assist the search for truth, and this has happened in Yusuf's case. Justice would not have been served and we wouldn't have faced this long and painful battle. And I'm in no doubt that what happened to Yusuf, the trial, and what came to light afterwards, caused the death of my mum.
You've got some issues with the kids. We've all been through that, believe me, even live on the television. But we very much heard your testimony about Yusuf, and thanks very much for contributing. I think what you've done is, again, you've spoken about truth and that you want the truth. And the Hillsborough Law is all about ensuring that families can get the truth. But also what we need to do is to ensure that the next generation are aware of such instances of injustice. And our next contribution is coming from my friend and colleague, Ian Byrne MP, who's going to talk to us about what his plans are to try to ensure that we can get things like Hillsborough on the curriculum so that we can teach people about our history.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for Andy. Thanks, everybody, for pulling this together. I can't really put into words how humbling and emotional it is to be involved today with such a momentous and important project to secure in Hillsborough Law for future generations. So never again will we see the establishment be able to do what they did in 1989 to so many people, and indeed the city and its class and our class. The giants who fought for justice who are no longer with us, I hope, will be watching down with pride at what will be a fitting legacy for their efforts, ensuring no other families will go through what they were put through. Along with the aims of Hillsborough Law, another key element which must be addressed must be ensuring that the lies and smears constructed by the South Yorkshire Police Force and their willing accomplices in the media and the political arena consigned once and all forever to the dustbin of history where they belong. In November, I launched the Real Truth Legacy project with this in mind, and it consists of 2 main elements. The first is a political education toolkit, which can be spread through the trade union movement, constituency Labour parties, like-minded organisations that are interested in learning more about the real truth about Hillsborough, which was the greatest miscarriage of justice this country's ever seen. The second element of the programme, what you touched on, Steve, is to make the entire story of Hillsborough part of the national curriculum. This would include a dedicated Hillsborough Day, which would take place on the nearest Friday running up to the anniversary of the tragedy. I've gathered support from across the Houses of Parliament with the early day motion I put down in November, calling for Hillsborough, which was a national disaster, to be part of the national curriculum. And on the back of the question that I asked the Prime Minister, again in November, we've secured meetings in a couple of weeks' time with ministers, ministers of education, with the aim of achieving that goal and working really closely, locally with the Mayor of Liverpool, and hopefully over the next few months we'll see that come to fruition. No, I'm really looking forward to working with all on this call. We've both participated and watched in making the Real Truth Legacy project a success and ensure that the legacies of Hillsborough is never forgotten by future generations and the lessons learned are never forgotten. I'd like to finish by thanking all involved in the fight for truth and justice over the last 33 years. And also touch on a thanks to Kevin Sampson, Maxine Peake, Stephen Walters and the Williams family for the magnificent production of Anne and telling the story, which I'm sure, I'm convinced after watching it this week, the resonance it's had across the country, that it do so much to embed the real truth around Hillsborough, and hopefully will now be understood what Hillsborough was and what it was about. Justice for the 97. Hillsborough Law now. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much, Ian. It spoke so powerfully, and it's brilliant that you've joined us today. And the campaign you're bringing about Hillsborough education in schools is so important. You know, kids go through schools and they learn all kinds of things about the aristocracy in years gone by, about kings and queens, but they don't learn the people's history. You can go through school and not learn about Peterloo or Hillsborough or Bloody Sunday or other things. And it's really important from here that people do learn how we were governed and policed in the past so that the next generation can make the changes that they need to make. So thanks so much for joining us, Ian. I now want to turn to someone who's representing the trade unions of our country, who actually have stood with the many campaigns that you've heard about today. They've always been there at the side of people fighting for justice, certainly at the side of the Hillsborough families over the years, at the side of the Grenfell families now and others. We didn't have the opportunity to invite every trade union individually. So what we wanted to do was to invite the General Secretary of the TUC to speak for all of our trade unions. And obviously it gives me a chance to thank them for their amazing support. But I now want to hand you over to Frances O'Grady. Frances.
Thanks very much, Andy, and thanks to you and to Steve for your tireless championship of the Hillsborough families. And it is my job to bring solidarity from the whole TUC, including Jay McKenna and the mighty Northwest TUC Regional Council, but the whole movement, because today, on behalf of the TUC, 6 million members up and down the country, every walk of life, we want to pledge to you our support for the Hillsborough Law. And like everybody else on the panel, I watched the ITV programme and One Mother's Story, and I will admit that I was again moved to tears. I think Maxine Peake and Steve Walters gave such powerful and sensitive performances that it was a tribute to the love and the loyalty of the Hillsborough families. But I'll be honest, that programme also made me angry all over again, because we've heard today, quite rightly, that this should not be a party political issue. But I tell you what, this is a class issue. The truth is that, as we saw at Hillsborough, in the midst of all the grief, the system was rigged against working class people. Not just the barefaced lies, the inequality of funding, the cover-ups, but the fact that the authorities tried to shift the blame onto the victims and the fans. And more than that, and this so often happens, you see it so often in these campaigns, they try to silence a whole community through shame. And I think that's worth thinking about, because what we have learned from the Hillsborough families and the whole people of Liverpool is that we will not be silenced and we will not be shamed. The trade union movement, for me, is also a family. It's about friendship between working people. It's about mutual support. And our very existence is about fighting for justice for our members at work, but for our communities too. And that's why we're natural supporters of all the campaigns that we've heard from today for truth and for justice, including Hillsborough, including the Stephen Lawrence campaign, the Shrewsbury building workers, the Orgreave miners, the Grenfell residents, and now, of course, the COVID bereaved families and many, many more. These are different campaigns, but we have one cause, and that cause is about the search for the truth and standing together for justice. So I do want to pay tribute to the Hillsborough families who have shown incredible resilience, dignity, love, and solidarity for more than 30 years. And it is not over yet, because yes, we want that Hillsborough Law now. We want to level those scales of justice, and it shouldn't matter. It should not matter what background you come from, your race or religion. Everybody should have equality before the law. And we should have the right to call the authorities to account. So bereaved families get the best legal representation, they get that duty of candour, and they get real accountability in the system. Now, I believe that working people across this country are fed up with an establishment that dishes out lies, double standards, and contempt for working class people. We want change, we want justice, and we won't stop until we get it. Solidarity, and thank you for everything you do.
Thanks, Frances. The wonderful Frances O'Grady there, really encapsulating everything that we need still to do for a number of different reasons and injustices. The next contribution, and I think it's our final contribution, is from a writer, a screenwriter, an author, and somebody who's responsible for the production of that wonderful 4-part series. And I personally, before I introduce Kevin, I found the first one really, really difficult to get through because it was such a vivid portrayal of what had happened on that fateful day. But the more I got into it, the more angry, as somebody said before, the more angry I seemed to get. And hopefully what Kevin has been able to do, and the wonderful cast that he had, is to ensure that people all around the country are now fully versed in the facts of Hillsborough. And I think it's resonated far and wide with that single vision of seeing something through the prism of a mother who lost her son. So I'll hand over to Kevin Sampson.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, as Steve has said there, judging from the reaction to the drama and the documentary that we've heard about, Anne Williams, that you've been watching over the last few nights, the country is appalled at the treatment of the Hillsborough families at the hands of the state. There's been a whole range of emotions, but chief amongst that has been outrage that this was allowed to happen in the first place, outrage that it went on for so very, very long. Very early on in the first episode of the drama about Anne Williams, her son Kevin is engaged in a classic teenage strop when his mum and dad tell him that he's not allowed to go to the FA Cup semi-final the next day. And he points at them, and with all the hurt he can muster, he says to them, "You two, you're just not fair. Not fair." And what isn't fair in all of these narratives that we've heard this afternoon is the way the state and the authorities and the establishment respond to these civic disasters. It's not fair that they're denied fundamental justice. It's not fair that the truth is delayed and hidden. And there is a narrative there. What we see anytime the authorities are held to account is a delaying process. It's a strangulation of truth, but it's also systematic denial of hope, so that the people that are forced to live through this agony have it prolonged, and they are denied those basic human rights to truth, but also to be allowed to grieve, to be allowed to put their loved ones to rest, and to try and find some sort of peace of mind. And it's just not on. This is a cross-party attempt to bring together something positive out of all these awful narratives that we've been hearing. And if there's one thing that this country supposedly prides itself on, it's British justice and British fair play. So let's start playing fair. Let's level the playing field, and in future, allow everybody to access justice and truth and fairness, just basic human fairness. Hillsborough Law now, please. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much indeed, Kevin. And in many ways, it's fitting to end with you today, because the screenplay you wrote, your words on people's in people's living rooms this week, really has kind of had such an impact, such a powerful impact, and has told, possibly better than ever before, what families go through when they're left fighting in the wilderness for justice. So thank you, Kevin. It won't just be in people's minds this week. I think what you've created with the Anne drama is something that will live for years to come, that will be a permanent record that people will go back to. And for that reason, you've done us all a great service, Kevin. It's been a big day, hasn't it? And thank you for bearing with us. So many, really important contributions. I won't go through them all by name, but I hope you'll feel what I said was true, that this is a broad-based campaign that covers all walks of life. You've heard from very eminent members of academia, journalism, the clergy, obviously the legal profession, but also the trade unions, and of course, 2 former prime ministers. That says everything, doesn't it, about the power of this campaign that's coming together, and the undeniable call for a Hillsborough Law now. So I just want to thank everybody who's taken part. I want to thank you for giving us your time and for supporting this call. And we just thought we'd finish today with the person who's been on our television screens, the person who I think everyone agrees gave, if you like, a stellar performance and put everything in. You could see she was putting everything in to portraying the life, the fight, the struggle of Anne Williams, and she did it so movingly, and we're all very much in her debt. So it feels appropriate today, as I thank you for giving us your time and your support. It feels appropriate for me to close this Hillsborough Law Now event by giving the final word to the amazing actor that she is, Maxine Peake.
Now, as we bring today's event to a close, I just want to thank you all for all your passion, commitment, for sharing your stories with us today. I know it can't have been easy, but also your continued commitment to the struggle, your continued commitment to getting the Hillsborough Law passed, because we know that this isn't over, that events like Hillsborough Grenfell, Manchester Arena, and the many other stories have been shared with us today will continue to happen. We continue to fight against a corrupt establishment. But you really are making a change, and I'm so sorry. I can't be with you in person, but I'm sending so much love. And as we know, solidarity and love, if we come together, we can make that change. And you, well, you've shown that. You've shown what solidarity, commitment can do. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And here's to the Hillsborough Law. Take care. Lots of love, Maxine.